The winter of 1944 fell across the Eastern Front like a shroud. Snow, deep and unforgiving, blanketed the scarred landscape, muffling the sounds of a war that had raged for years. For the German soldiers hunkered down in their fortified positions, the cold was a familiar enemy, but one they believed they had mastered. They had endured previous winters, learned the cruel lessons of frostbite and frozen machinery. Now, they saw the snow not as a threat, but as an ally. It was a great white wall that would halt any Soviet advance. Their commanders had assured them that the enemy's supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. No army, they were told, could sustain a major offensive in these conditions. The Red Army would freeze and starve long before it reached their lines. This confidence was a shield against the biting wind. It was a warmth kindled by past victories and a belief in their own superior engineering and discipline. A German Oberleutnant named Klaus Richter stood on a ridge overlooking a vast, snow-covered plain. He adjusted his collar and blew into his gloved hands, his breath turning to instant frost. Below him, his men were dug in, their positions reinforced with timber and earth. They were weary, yes, but their morale was firm. They had held this ground for months, repelling smaller Soviet probes with practiced efficiency. The reports from high command were clear. The Allies were exhausted. The great push that had begun in the summer had finally run out of steam, just as they had predicted. In the makeshift bunkers and along the trench lines, the soldiers spoke of home. They talked of Christmas, of seeing their families again soon. The war, they felt, was entering its final, predictable phase on this front. The Soviets had thrown everything they had at them, and still they held. The land itself was now their greatest weapon. The roads were impassable sheets of ice, the rivers frozen solid but not thick enough to support heavy armor in all places. Any attempt to move fuel, ammunition, or food in large quantities would be a fool's errand. The vast distances of the East, which had once swallowed Napoleon's Grande Armée, would now consume the Red Army's logistical tail. It was a simple, brutal calculation. The generals in their distant headquarters reviewed maps overlaid with weather reports. Every forecast confirmed their strategic assumptions. Operation Bagration had been a disaster for the Wehrmacht, but it had come at a great cost to the Soviets as well. Now winter was here to give the German forces time to regroup, rearm, and reinforce their lines. They would let General Winter, their old, reliable ally, do the heavy work. The idea that the Allies could mount a coordinated, large-scale armored assault was dismissed as fantasy. The panzers would be refueled and ready by spring, while the Soviet tanks would be left as frozen steel statues, their fuel tanks empty, their crews defeated not by German guns, but by the implacable Russian cold. It began as a low, persistent hum on the horizon. At first, it was mistaken for the wind whistling through the skeletal remains of a forest. But it grew steadily, a deep-throated vibration that could be felt in the frozen earth more than it could be heard. Oberleutnant Richter raised his binoculars, his eyes scanning the endless white expanse to the east. A dark line had appeared against the gray winter sky. It was long, impossibly long, and it was moving. It snaked through the low hills, a black scar on the pure snow. It was not an infantry column. It moved too quickly, too mechanically for that. It was something else entirely. Something big. The men in the forward listening posts were the first to report it clearly. A convoy, the crackle of the field telephone reported. Hundreds of vehicles. They look like trucks, sir. Fuel trucks. The news was passed up the chain of command, met mostly with skepticism and a touch of arrogance. A fuel convoy? In this weather? The German commanders scoffed. It was a desperate, suicidal gesture by a Soviet command that refused to accept reality. The trucks would get bogged down in the snow. Their engines would freeze. They would be easy targets for artillery and the few Luftwaffe planes that could still operate in these conditions. It was a gift, not a threat. Richter watched through his optics as the convoy drew nearer, resolving into individual shapes. They were American-made Studebaker trucks, hundreds of them, a testament to the Lend-Lease program that was pouring Allied industrial might into the Soviet war machine. They moved in perfect formation, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow. They were not struggling. They were not scattered. They moved with a purpose and order that was unsettling. The German soldiers who had gathered to watch let out jeers and cynical laughter. "Look at them," one said. "They'll be frozen solid by nightfall. We can pick up the fuel ourselves in the morning." But as the hours passed, the convoy did not falter. It just kept coming. The sound of its engines became a constant, churning roar that filled the air, a sound of industrial power defying the power of nature. The initial amusement among the German troops slowly began to fade, replaced by a grudging curiosity, and then a flicker of unease. This was not the disorganized, desperate rabble they had been led to expect. This was something different. It was organized. It was relentless. The sheer scale of it was hard to comprehend. It was a river of steel and gasoline, flowing steadily across a landscape that was supposed to be a fortress of ice. What the Germans saw as a desperate gamble was, in fact, one of the most meticulously planned logistical operations of the war. This was not just a collection of trucks. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem on wheels, designed to conquer the Russian winter. The planners, a mix of Soviet and Allied logistics officers, had spent months studying every detail. They knew that standard trucks would fail. So, every vehicle in the convoy, from the lead Studebaker to the last repair vehicle, had been winterized. Special lubricants that wouldn't turn to sludge were used in the engines and gearboxes. Heaters were installed in the engine blocks and battery compartments to ensure they would start in the sub-zero temperatures. The drivers were a special breed, chosen for their endurance and skill. Many were veterans of the Siberian transport routes, men and women who understood the treachery of ice and snow. They worked in shifts, ensuring no one drove for too long without rest. Inside their cabs, they had rations, insulated clothing, and orders that were brutally simple: do not stop. If a truck broke down, they were to pull over immediately. They were not to attempt their own repairs and block the path. The flow of the convoy was paramount. The lifeblood of the coming offensive depended on it. It was a level of coordination the German command simply did not believe the Allies were capable of achieving. The organization extended far beyond the drivers. Trailing the main body of fuel tankers were specialized support units that made the convoy a true steel serpent. There were mobile mechanic workshops, trucks loaded with spare parts for every conceivable breakdown. Welders, engine specialists, and electricians were ready to deploy at a moment's notice. There were even specially designed snowplows and grader vehicles interspersed throughout the column, their sole job to clear the path and keep the road passable for the hundreds of trucks behind them. Small engineering teams were on standby, ready to reinforce frozen river crossings or repair a damaged culvert with astonishing speed. This convoy was not just transporting fuel, it was a mobile supply line that repaired itself as it moved. Communication was key. Radio discipline was strict, with coded messages relaying information about road conditions, enemy sightings, and mechanical issues. Every section leader knew the status of the vehicles under their command. The entire operation was a symphony of precision and forethought, a direct challenge to the German belief that logistics were the Allies' greatest weakness on this vast and hostile front. The Germans saw a line of trucks. What they failed to see was the intricate interlocking system of support that made the line unbreakable. As the reality of the convoy's progress began to sink in, the German command moved from dismissal to alarm. Orders were hastily issued. This supply line had to be cut, and it had to be cut now. The first attempts were made with long-range artillery. Shells began to rain down on the plains, churning up huge geysers of snow and black earth. From their vantage point, Richter and his men watched as explosions blossomed near the column of trucks. They expected to see chaos, trucks swerving off the road, fires breaking out. They expected the convoy to halt, to scatter in panic. But it did not. The Allied planners had anticipated this. They had routed the convoy along a path calculated to be at the extreme range of most German artillery pieces, forcing the gunners to fire inaccurately. The trucks themselves maintained a specific distance from one another, a carefully calculated interval that minimized the chance of a single shell causing a chain reaction. When a shell did land close, the drivers held their course, their hands gripping the steering wheels, their eyes fixed on the truck in front of them. The discipline was unnerving. The convoy absorbed the blows and continued its inexorable advance, the gaps left by the few destroyed trucks quickly closing as the column pushed forward. Next, the Luftwaffe was called in. A handful of Focke-Wulf fighters and Stuka dive bombers, scrambled from icy airfields, appeared in the sky. They swooped down on the convoy, their machine guns and cannons blazing. This, the Germans believed, would surely be the end of it. A single well-placed cannon shell into a fuel tanker would create a devastating fireball. But here, too, the convoy was prepared. Dispersed within the column were trucks armed with heavy anti-aircraft machine guns. As the German planes began their attack runs, the sky erupted with tracer fire, a web of lead that forced the pilots to pull up or risk being torn apart. The attacks were relentless but sporadic. A truck would explode in a brilliant orange flash, sending a column of black smoke billowing into the winter sky. But for every truck lost, 100 more pressed on. The mobile repair crews would even rush to a burning wreck, not to save it, but to quickly clear the debris from the road, ensuring the path remained open. The German attacks, meant to be decisive blows, felt like swatting at a giant. They could sting it, they could wound it, but they could not stop its forward momentum. For the soldiers watching on the ground, a chilling realization began to dawn. Their weapons were not having the effect they were supposed to. The true test of the convoy came not just from enemy fire, but from the brutal landscape itself. As night fell, the temperature plummeted even further. A blizzard swept in, reducing visibility to near zero and burying the cleared road under a fresh layer of deep snow. This was the moment the German command had been waiting for. Nature itself would now finish the job. But the convoy's internal systems were designed for exactly this. The lead snowplows, massive machines with powerful engines, redoubled their efforts, their lights cutting through the blinding storm as they carved a path forward, their crews working in a state of intense, focused exhaustion. A section of the road that ran along a steep embankment gave way under the weight of the trucks, sending a fuel tanker sliding into a deep ravine. The column behind it halted. On the German lines, a cheer went up. This was it. The line was broken. The blockage would freeze the entire convoy in place, making it a sitting duck for their artillery. But before the German gunners could even get their new coordinates, the convoy's engineers were in action. A heavy recovery vehicle, essentially a crane on a truck chassis, moved to the edge of the collapse. Floodlights cut through the darkness as engineers rappelled into the ravine, not to save the truck, but to secure the road. Working with breathtaking speed and precision in the howling wind, they used prefabricated steel plates and timber carried on their own trucks to build a temporary bridge over the damaged section. Within 2 hours, a task that should have taken days was complete. The lead truck of the waiting column carefully tested the bridge, then rolled across. One by one, the rest followed. The unbroken chain had been reforged. The drivers, cold and weary, felt a surge of pride and determination. They were not just driving trucks, they were part of a living thing, a team that refused to be beaten by the enemy or the elements. This scene was repeated countless times along the route. A dozen trucks would get stuck in a sudden snowdrift, and teams with shovels and tow cables would descend, digging and pulling until every last vehicle was free. An engine would seize up and a mobile workshop would pull alongside, the mechanics swarming over it like ants, replacing the frozen part in minutes. The Germans, listening to the constant muffled roar of the engines through the blizzard, could not understand what was happening. They had assumed the convoy would fail because its individual parts would fail. They never imagined that the strength of the convoy was not in its individual trucks, but in the teamwork that bound them all together. By the morning of the third day, the convoy had passed the main German observation posts. The sound of its engines began to fade into the west, towards the Allied lines. On the ridge, Oberleutnant Richter lowered his binoculars, a profound sense of disbelief washing over him. They had thrown everything they had at it: artillery, air attacks. They had counted on the blizzards, the ice, the sheer impossibility of the task. And yet, the convoy had succeeded. It had suffered losses, yes. The black smudges of smoke on the horizon were a testament to that. But the vast majority of the trucks had made it through. The steel serpent had not been slain. Down in the trenches, the mood was grim. The cynical laughter of 2 days ago was gone, replaced by a stunned, uneasy silence. The soldiers had witnessed something that their training and their commanders had told them was impossible. It wasn't just the convoy's success that was so demoralizing, it was the way it had succeeded. The relentless efficiency, the incredible organization, the refusal to be stopped. It spoke of an enemy that was not exhausted and desperate, but powerful, resourceful, and incredibly determined. It was a display of industrial and logistical might that Germany could no longer hope to match. The reports sent back to German headquarters were met with anger and disbelief. The generals accused their field commanders of exaggeration, of incompetence. But as reports flooded in from different sectors along the front, all telling the same story, the truth could no longer be denied. The fuel had gotten through. This was not a minor logistical failure on their part, it was a major strategic success for the Allies. It meant their entire defensive posture, which was based on the assumption that the Red Army would be crippled by winter, was now fundamentally flawed. A deep crack had appeared in the foundation of their confidence. For a soldier like Richter, the implications were terrifyingly clear. He looked west, toward his own rear lines where the Soviet armor was known to be massing. Those tanks, which he had believed would remain silent and frozen until spring, would now have the fuel they needed to move. The rumbling he had heard for days was not the sound of a desperate gamble. It was the sound of an engine of war being started. The snow-covered plains that he had seen as a protective barrier now seemed like a perfect open highway for an armored assault. The winter, which had been their trusted ally, was about to be turned against them. The silence that followed the convoy's passing was more menacing than the roar of its engines had ever been. The arrival of the fuel convoy at the forward Allied staging areas was like a shot of adrenaline to the heart of the Red Army. The tankers, coated in ice and scarred by their journey, were greeted as heroes. The fuel they carried was more precious than gold. It was immediately pumped into the waiting tanks of an entire tank army, hundreds of T-34s that had been sitting idle, their crews keeping them maintained but unable to advance. The low rumble of the convoy was soon replaced by a new sound, the deafening roar of hundreds of tank engines firing up in unison, a chorus of steel and power ready to be unleashed. Within 48 hours, the offensive began. What the German command had deemed impossible was now happening. A massive armored spearhead, fully fueled and supplied, smashed into their lines. The German defenses, prepared for static infantry skirmishes, were completely overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the assault. The panzer divisions held in reserve were caught off guard, many with insufficient fuel themselves to maneuver effectively. The very weapon the Germans had counted on, winter, was now used against them, as the frozen, flat ground provided an ideal terrain for a rapid tank advance. The breakthrough was immediate and decisive. The T-34s, powered by the fuel from the convoy, poured through the gaps in the German lines, encircling entire divisions and forcing a catastrophic retreat. The soldiers who had watched the convoy pass in disbelief were now running for their lives, their fortified positions overrun in a matter of hours. The confidence that had sustained them through the bitter cold shattered completely. They had been outmaneuvered not by a brilliant new tactic on the battlefield, but by a simple, brutally effective act of logistics that they had dismissed as impossible. It was a lesson taught by roaring engines and endless tank treads. In the grand history of the war, the story of this single convoy might be a footnote. But it serves as a powerful reminder that wars are not won by battles alone. They are won by logistics, by planning, and by the quiet, uncelebrated work of countless individuals. The drivers, mechanics, and engineers of that steel serpent never fired a shot at the enemy's front line, but their courage and teamwork delivered the blow that broke it. They proved that a simple line of trucks, moving with purpose and precision, could change the course of a battle, and in doing so, help decide the outcome of the war. What seems small, a column of trucks against a vast horizon, can carry the weight of victory.